Ok, mira, aquí tenemos The Science of Solitary Confinement de Common Lit. Saben que es science, pero estas palabras solitary confinement. So confinement, esta palabra, es el cárcel. Y solitary es solo. So a veces ponen personas que están en el cárcel solo, sin otras personas. So aquí en esta caja dice que solitary confinement is the isolation of a prisoner from any human form of human contact. This 2014 informational text explores how solitary confinement affects prisoners and the role it plays in the American prison system. As you read, take notes on how prisoners are mentally and physically affected by solitary confinement. Picture MetLife Stadium, the New Jersey venue that hosted the Super Bowl earlier this month in February 2014. It seats 82,556 people in total, making it the largest stadium in the NFL. Imagine the crowd it takes to fill that enormous stadium. That, give or take 1,000, is the number of men and women held in solitary confinement across the U.S. Although the practice has been largely discontinued in most countries, it's become increasingly routine over the past few decades within the American prison system. Once employed largely as a short-term punishment, it's now regularly used as a way of disciplining prisoners indefinitely, isolating them during ongoing investigations, coercing them into cooperating with interrogations, and even separating them from perceived threats with the prison population at their request. As the number of prisoners in solitary has exploded, psychologists and neuroscientists have attempted to understand the ways in which a complete lack of human contact changes us over long term. According to a panel of scientists that recently spoke at the American Association for the Advancement of Science's annual meeting in Chicago, research tells us that solitary is both ineffective as a rehabilitation technique and inevitably harmful to the mental health of those detained. The United States, in many ways, is an outlier in the world, said Craig Haiti, a psychologist at UC Santa Cruz who spent the last few decades studying the mental effects of the prison system, especially solitary confinement. We really are the only country that resorts regularly and on a long-term basis to this form of punitive confinement punishment. Ironically, we spend very little time analyzing the effects of it. Exact numbers are hard to come by, but based on a wide swath of censuses, it's estimated that between 80,000 and 81,000 prisoners are in some form of solitary confinement nationwide. In contrast to stereotypes of isolated prisoners as the most dangerous criminals, Haney estimates that a third of isolated prisoners are mentally ill, and a disproportionate number are minorities, partly because alleged gang membership is grounds for placing a prisoner in solitary indefinitely, forever, para siempre. The physical details of an isolated prisoner's daily experience are worth examining. ¿Qué hacen cada día? Prisoners live in their cells, 80 square feet on average, a bit bigger than a king-size bed. In this environment, you sleep, you eat, you defecate or poop, you live all of your life. Haney said, most prisoners spend at least 23 hours per day in this environment, devoid of a stimulant. Some are allowed in a yard or indoor area for an hour or less daily, and are denied physical contact on visits from friends and family so that they may go years or decades without touching another human, apart from when they're placed in physical restraints by guards. This sort of existence takes a clear toll on prisoners, according to surveys and interviews Haney and colleagues have conducted with about 500 of those in isolation from 4 different states. Their work indicates that most of these prisoners suffer from severe psychological stress that begins when they're put in isolation and doesn't subdue over time. A majority of those surveyed experienced symptoms such as dizziness, heart palpitations, chronic depression, while 41% reported hallucinations and 27% reported suicidal thoughts. All levels significantly higher than those of the overall prison population. An unrelated study published last week found that isolated inmates are 7 times more likely to hurt or kill themselves than inmates at large. Sorry. Ooh, gotta go back. Oh my gosh, I lost my spot. Those were right here. It's almost like these effects, Haney says, don't only show how isolation harms inmates, they tell us that it achieves the opposite of the supposed goals of rehabilitation for re-entering into society. We are all social beings, and people who are in environments that deny the opportunity to interact in a meaningful way with others begin to lose a sense of self or their own identity, he said. They begin to withdraw from the little amount of social contact they are allowed to have because social stimulation over time becomes anxiety arousing. Huda Akil, a neuroscientist at the University of Michigan, is interested in the neurological impacts of isolation, but is limited by the fact that no U.S. prison is willing to allow its otherwise isolated prisoners to take part in research. Instead, she and others must rely on more basic findings about how stimulation and social interaction affect the brain, and infer the potential impacts of isolation from that. For one, there's the fact that a large amount of brain activity is driven by circadian rhythms, which are in turn, so circadian rhythms, cuando estamos durmiéndonos y despiertanos, so which are in turn set by the exposure to the sun. Autopsies on people who have committed suicide after suffering from depression have shown that in their brains, gene expression is significantly less aligned with circadian rhythms. Other research has shown that restricting exposure to sunlight and thereby interfering with circadian rhythms increases the prevalence of depression. Thus, if inmates are already prone to depression, solitary probably makes them more so, she says. The proper functioning of the brain depends on daily sun exposure, potentially explaining some of the symptoms experienced by prisoners in isolation, many of whom rarely see the sun. There are also troubling neurological implications of long-term isolation that stem from the fact that brain architecture can change over time. The hippocampus, in particular, has been found to dramatically shrink in the brain of people who are depressed or stressed for extended periods, a concern because it's crucially involved in memory, geographic orientation, cognition, and decision-making. No one has performed an autopsy on a person who lived in isolation for decades, suffering from depression at the whole time, but Akil believes that in keeping inmates in full isolation, authorities are ruining a very critical component of the brain that's sensitive to stress. Apart from scientists, the Chicago panel featured activist Robert King, who spent 29 years isolated in a 6 by 9 foot cell in Louisiana prison before his murder conviction was overturned in 2001. Although he endured solitary confinement more successfully than most, he says he maintained a hopeful attitude and never considered hurting himself. He experienced unmistakable physiological changes. Most dramatically, King has difficulty navigating open spaces. I lose the ability to meet with the broader terrain. I had become acclimated to shorter distances, he said, attributing this change to the shrinkage of his hippocampus. I cannot, even to this day, acclimate myself to a broader distance. My geography is really shot. His eyesight also deteriorated to the point where he is nearly blind, though it's gradually improved since he was released. It's impossible to say how isolated prisoners as a whole fare compared to King, but there's no systematic collection of data on their well-being in the U.S. prison system. But the researchers argue that just these hints of damage wrought by solitary confinement and the way it seems to make prisoners less equipped to re-enter society after their sentence indicate that it falls within a category of discipline banned by the Eighth Amendment. Cruel and unusual punishment. It seems to me that it is time for us to have a serious discussion about the wisdom and humanity in the policy of this policy in the United States, Haney said. So, in summary, this article, the author presents information that describes all the negative impacts of solitary confinement. Okay, he's saying solitary confinement is bad. It's contra. So first question says, which of the following identifies the main idea of the text? I'm going to mark out A and B. Your choices will be C and D. Now part 2 says, which detail, so which of these details right here supports this answer up here? It is not A and it is not C. So those are your two choices. Now number 3 says, how does the inclusion of Robert King's experience, remember he had a bad experience, he was in solitary confinement, contribute to the text? So is it C or D? Remember, he said still to this day he's having problems with his vision, being able to walk. So vision probs. He has bad sense of direction. And he got out in 2001. 20 years he's been out of prison and he still has problems. So number 4 says, which quote from the text best supports the answer to part A? And those are your two answer choices. Now number 5 says, how do the results of solitary confinement differ from the overachieving goals of the American prison system? So the goal, remember, is to reintroduce prisoners to society. Solitary does not achieve this goal because, and for here, I want you to give me 1, 2, and 3 ways that solitary confinement hurts prisoners and does not help them get back to society.